So if you've got your favorite under-recognized economists, let Malesh know. He's been issuing the invitations.
Right, and I see from the signs that we are now live on YouTube. It is about to flip over to 11 o'clock my time, when we can get this seminar series on the way.
Timothy will come back briefly and say a quick word, just introduce the Kiev School of Economics and the series, and then we'll turn it over.
All right, I guess I'll start. My name is Timothy Milovanov. I'm the president of the Kiev School of Economics, and I'm very excited to introduce the series today with Jean Tirole speaking, and I'm very grateful to Malesh and Colin who put this series together, and to Alessandro for chairing it, and to Hamid and others for helping to set it up. I'm in Ukraine now, and I came back to Ukraine 2 days before the war started. I lead the Kiev School of Economics there, which is a graduate school similar to High School of Economics or New Economic School in Russia. Is this a challenging times for Ukrainian and Russian academics, and we're figuring out how to interact and how to feel about different things. And we in Ukraine, of course, we're in Kiev, so many of us, well, all of us woke up on the 24th of February from bombardments, actually. The Kiev School of Economics is operational, and this series in solidarity with all Ukrainian academics, including those whose institutions and universities have been destroyed and whose students and faculty have been displaced or killed. And I hope we as an intellectual community of the world will demonstrate the resilience and strength. The Russian troops have done things which are inhumane, even to our students. Some of our students were stuck in the villages next to Kiev controlled by Russian troops, and they were not given water, for example, simply water, kept in basements for 2 weeks. So most of our students are in safety. No one is dead. No one has been killed yet. So we're very fortunate. Of course, we're traumatized, but we have restored our operations. I think the role of academia is to rethink and reevaluate what's happening with societies and the world. And I hope and I believe that academia will come out stronger from this experience in Central and Eastern Ukraine now, and to try to understand what went wrong with the world and how is it that societies can end up in situations like that. I am very upset about some of the Russian institutions issuing statements in support of the war, although I understand the climate in which they operate. And this is a horrible climate, and I don't wish any academic to ever find themselves under such tremendous pressure. So I'm grateful to everyone in Ukraine and in Russia, in academia, who are human and carry the light of humanity through these difficult times. And I'm grateful to academia around the world for supporting humanity during these times. And thank you very much. And I'll give the floor now to the chair.
Thank you, Tima. It's truly an honor to be here, and it's our presence is a token in support of what you're all doing in Kiev, which is truly inspiring, and at a personal level, even more so for a theorist coming from writing papers like you to seeing what you're doing now. It is also a great honor to introduce Jean Tirole as the kickoff speaker of this series. Jean is the honorary chairman of the Toulouse School of Economics and the Jean-Jacques Lafont Foundation, and recipient of the 2014 Nobel Prize in Economics. Nobody on this Zoom webinar needs me to summarize Jean's career accomplishments. So instead of doing that, I am going to tell you how he's advancing a research agenda that's of great importance for economics and society right now. I'm of course talking about his work on privacy. And I see many of the participants and myself when we work on privacy, we often open his IO textbook and adapt one of those models to these questions. And I think Jean is once again leading the way in showing us new problems, new perspectives on these problems, and also new approaches to tackle them. So I'm very excited to introduce Jean's talk today. In terms of logistics, I'll be moderating the Q&A, interrupt only with critical clarifying questions, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Jean, thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you, Malesh and Colin, for that. I think this is a great honor, and thank you, Timothy, for the introduction. I cannot imagine, we cannot imagine what you're going through right now, and you have been going through, and every little bit of solidarity, and this is very small solidarity, we can bring some comfort. But I can assure you that our institutions are all in solidarity with you. It's some passive, but it's also admiration, not only for the courage, but also for what you're doing. This seminar series is remarkable in the sense that you are looking into the future, which is not an easy thing to do right now for you. So what I'm going to talk about today has relatively little to do with your own ongoing concerns, of course, and I understand this is a seminar series, and you know, unlike, for example, Paul Krugman's remarkable talk the other day, this is a different object. There's a little bit of a connection between what I'm going to talk about and the current situation, which is the growing discomfort of autocrats with anything which has to do with freedom of speech and democratic expression. Now, at their door, in your case, but also more and more in many countries within their countries, against their own citizens. And you mentioned what happens with Russian academics and intellectuals. Now, let me share some slides with you. And Alessandro, you can stop me, of course, whenever you want, or any of you can stop me whenever you want. So the reason why we are more and more concerned about privacy and the control of citizens is that it has become cheaper and cheaper actually to monitor the behavior of people. So we have a technological evolution. You can take pictures and movies with your smartphone, artificial intelligence, facial recognition, and the like. Many other things which basically make it easy for not only for platforms, but also governments to know your preferences and your social graph for almost zero cost. So it has become extremely cheap to know who you are. And that raises a number of issues, going from the expansion of the public sphere in democracies, and with some cost to that, to the surveillance societies that you see more and more in autocracies. At the start of the thing, like 10 or 15 years ago, we saw that this technological evolution, partly because it's decentralized, is going to favor democracy. But in the end, we start more and more realizing that it's not going to favor democracy. And we have some of that with the Chinese social credit system that I'm going to discuss later on. But there are also examples of issues which are rising because of this new technology. One aspect of it is linked with debate on Huxley and Orwell about the control of citizens. So you remember that Orwell in 1984 emphasized violence and brute force against the people, the police intervention, and so on. Whereas Huxley envisioned a very different way of controlling citizens. And actually, he has this interesting letter to Orwell in which he said, no, this is a beautiful novel you wrote, but this is too costly in a sense. Keeping in the long run boot on the face policy is going to be extremely costly, and governments will find cheaper ways of actually controlling citizens. Now, he could not, of course, think about artificial intelligence and facial recognition, but In a sense, that's what's happening right now. Before I start, I would like to say that privacy is not an individual choice. I mean, even so, we are used to saying, well, this is our choice, we can remain private or not. Even in a democracy, it's pretty hard to keep our privacy. Sometimes it's our own doing. Sometimes it's rational, actually, because we don't want to spend our life reading consent form or forgo services because we want to stay away from data collection and storage. Sometimes we are less rational. We click impulsively without looking at the consequences of that. And for us economists, we also think about what's called data externalities. The fact that other people disclose information about us anyway, so they can post pictures of us, comment about health or political opinion. And all of that depends on the social norm. And we're still thinking about what the social norm is going to be in the future, but there are clearly data externalities where people reveal some stuff about ourselves. And finally, there is something which we economists emphasize quite a lot, is unraveling. The fact that even if you don't have to give your data, the fact that you are not giving your data actually reveals something about you, and that the nothing to hide stuff. So if an employer is asking you for your Facebook page and says, oh, don't worry, you don't have to give me your Facebook page, you're not legally forced to it. Nonetheless, if you don't give it, of course, that's a signal that you don't want to give it, that you have something to hide. And that was a little bit the idea in Postner's article. At some point, non-disclosure becomes fraud. And we understand unraveling in economics, of course. And then this idea that we should be transparent is actually very widespread and has led to a number of dystopian movies and novels, as well as things which was not science fiction. So if you think about Gläserne Mensch in Eastern Germany, the idea is that everybody should be transparent. This is already that was some signal of what might come now. Now, we economists tend to distinguish between consensual issues and divisive issues, with consensual issues being the case for transparency, more or less. So an issue is consensual if we kind of agree on what's right and what's wrong. So we agree that polluting is not very nice, that crime is not very nice. And there is the idea in economics, of course, that transparency is going to create accountability. And to some extent, that's quite right. So, if your career depends on what we achieve, then we are going to work harder, suppliers produce better quality products and so on. They are going to, and it's transparent, that's going to help them give incentives. And of course, politicians and countries can be kept somewhat on their toes if there are journalists covering the war or covering their policies. And indeed, there is a very large lab and field experimental literature showing that when we are observed by other people, we behave better. There are lots of experiments in various fields which have proved exactly that actually having a bigger public somehow, being watched by one's peers or even by strangers actually is going to promote good behavior, with some caveats. And there are some caveats to that, and I'm going to give you 3 caveats. The first caveat has to do with the coexistence of public and private sphere. So we all interact in a public way. At the same time, we also interact in private spheres where our behavior is observed by only our peers, our family, our friends, and the like. When you have coexistence between those 2 spheres, the way, if we behave decently in the public sphere, which we'll have a tendency to do because we're observed, then that's going to induce more licensing for behavior in private sphere. So technically, for an economist, a signal in the public sphere will reduce the benefit of signaling in the private sphere. So we'll behave better in the public sphere, but we behave less well in the private sphere. And more licensing in turn in turn is going to imply that an expansion in the public sphere of the kind we're seeing now may even reduce overall prosociality, so prosociality in both public and private sphere, despite the composition effect that if you have more of a private sphere, you observe more in a sense and you should behave better. And that's a theoretical prediction. There is also some experimental evidence for that. The second caveat is a right to oblivion. So if we commit a crime, we should pay for it. But for how long? And that's a question, which is that at some point, the record should be erased because that gives us a second chance to reintegrate into society. Because if your record is never erased, then you are kind of constrained to keep living in crime. So it's just an incentive argument, if you want, that sure you must be punished, but there must be erasure of this record. But of course, with a digital world, it's pretty hard to guarantee. And the third, and there are other caveats as well, but the third caveat I want to mention about this general conclusion that transparency is beneficial is that social punishment can be kind of random. So you don't know whether you'll be facing mild ostracism from a few people or it's going to be a mob action in general. So, and there are papers about that as well. Now, to those consensual issues, you can oppose divisive issues. So divisive issues are issues on which we don't agree. Not everybody agrees on what the right thing to do. And of course, it's very society specific, time specific, but think about politics, about sexual orientation in some countries, about ethnicity, religion, secularism, vaccines, social roles. I mean, even democracy actually, unfortunately, is now a divisive issue, as you know too well. So the problem with divisive issues is that it creates ostracism, discrimination, hatred, fueling, violence by all kinds of people who disagree with you. And that can be, this deterioration of the social fabric can be actually very costly. It's costly to those who want to act, they want to show their political stance or their sexual orientation or whatnot. They want to be authentic because they may be the victims of violence. But it can be costly even for neutral individuals who don't take side or don't want to take side because they are viewed suspiciously by both sides. They're asked to take sides with the reasoning that if they are not with us, they are with them, okay? And actually, Timothy talked about that earlier with a Russian scientist. And that's always a very difficult situation. We see that also in the West with artists, musicians. I'm not talking about those who actually support Putin or support the war, but those who are kind of embarrassed because they are sympathetic to the Ukrainians, but at the same time, they have families in Russia and so on, and they have job in Russia. So their situation is more difficult. They are put in a bind which they may not want to be in. But in any case, those divisive issues create a lot of issues. And when you are facing that, you have two possible reactions. So for those who want to act, they're afraid to act. One possibility is that they change their behavior altogether. So that's the chilling effect of public spaces. So people don't dare to speak their mind because they're afraid of antagonistic reaction. They may obey majoritarian views and so on. The alternative behavior is to keep doing or saying what you want to do or say, but basically you hide in a safe space where you are kind of protected against the general hostility against you. So the safe space can be physical, that can be the home, and even safer, the diary if it's not stolen, but it could be all kinds of things as we know. It can even be virtual space where you are with like-minded people, and that has good and bad aspects. So it's a good aspect, of course, because it protects you from violence and the like, but it also has some issues. First, it comes with private cost. And the first cost, which is obvious, is that you have a reduced use of public space. So think about sexual minorities who cannot enjoy the public space anymore. So there are lots of other examples, but also in the extreme, they may also select their social graph in such a way that it's not very diverse, because they just want people who think alike and they can trust, not to disclose information. And socially, there are also costs of safe spaces, which is that once you are taking refuge in a safe space, then you are tempted first yourself to signal to the member of the safe space that you're really one of them, and you may be more Catholic than the Pope in a sense. You may be too much, or you can be forced by the member of the safe space actually to be a bit of an extremist, because they can threaten you to out you, exclude you, and that's the possibility. So the consequences, and we see that on Facebook groups, consequences is very one-sided narrative, hate speech, conspiracy theory, and even violence against the out group, just to prove that you are one of the members of the safe space and you are not going to be excluded or outed. And all those are social costs. So there's still more thought which must be given. I mean, as Timothy said earlier, all what is happening now, and obviously the biggest example being the war in Ukraine, but you have to ask yourself, what kind of society are we going to live in the next 30 or 40 years, and maybe later on, and we need to think more about all those things, what I call the social science fiction that is going to be very important. In terms of social scores and the surveillance society, it's a kind of mix of a little of the two, in a sense, of the consensual issues and the divisive issues. So let me talk about China's social credit system. By the way, it's in China now because first there is a political situation which is conducive to that, but also the Chinese are extremely advanced technologically. So it's actually much easier to do in China, but this is not a Chinese phenomenon. It's going to spread in the world, in a way that we might not want to spread. Now, if you look at the interesting stuff about the Chinese social credit system, is that it's going to aggregate data into a single score, according to a variety of criteria, which are not cast in stone, which is actually interesting. Some you might think are reasonable, credit history, tax compliance, environmental friendly behavior, and so on. There's still the issue of how much weight you put on each of those. Of course, being French, I don't think that jaywalking is more important than tax evasion, but we can discuss that, and we can put different ways on this. Some are reasonable but are highly manipulable, so spreading fake news, and we see that now with Putin in Russia. What is a fake news? Of course, this is for us it's relatively simple, but it's in practice it's much more complicated. I'd say for a scientist, there's a definition of a fake news, but for others, they tend to have categories of fake news which are very broad. And then there are some very unappealing ones like social graph, personal traits, features of political opinions, and the like. Now, what is it going to be used for in China? Well, it's going to be used for public stigmatization. So basically, having the society punish you. I don't want to be a friend with a low score person somehow, and we'll come back to that. And then direct punishments, which are not jail. They are more like taxes in some way, or prohibition. So basically, restriction of access to employment, transportation, visas abroad, and the like. And that will be a very low cost way of basically controlling citizens. because you just need artificial intelligence and facial recognition for that. As I said, it's a key mixture of consensual and divisive behavior. So if it was just consensual behavior, I mean, as I said, there is a question about the weight and all those things and how long it should stay on the platform. But, by and large, the social score will boost self-image, boost image concerns, and therefore pro-social behavior. So it will have a positive effect on pro-social behavior. And actually, there have been experiments showing how social scores actually can boost pro-social behavior. But of course, the problem is that the state, and also in broader application, platforms and religious organizations can exploit the agents, society's interest in each other's score to promote political compliance. So, if I want to know whether I'm dealing with Alessandro in some trade, I want to know whether he's a reliable person. The problem is that if Alessandro has a bad grade, it might be because he's an unreliable person, or because he has political opinions that don't please the government. And that shed some suspicion on Alessandro just because he was a dissenter. Actually, I might think he's not reliable. And this bundling pro-social behavior with political compliance, which is exactly what the Chinese social score does, into a single score, actually may be useful for the government actually to promote political compliance. Another way to promote political compliance is to use guilt by association. So I'm a friend of Alessandro, and he has a poor rating, a bad grade, then I'm going to have a poor rating or bad grade. Sorry, Alessandro, I was not meant to pick on you. I know that you are above any suspicion, so I can use you as a good example. So anyway, so what I'm not going to go through all of that, but it's a least cost approach. And the state is going to be willing to bundle the two dimensions into a single score, so both the consensual and divisive dimension, if it's sufficiently autocratic. So think of being autocratic, you have a convex combination, sorry for the technical stuff, but of basically the welfare of citizens and the control of citizens. So someone who is more autocratic is someone who puts more weight on the control of citizens, that they don't dissent, for example. Okay, and it's much more efficient somehow for the government in a society of strangers. So the kind of society of large cities, of trade on the web and so on, than in tight-knit society. So, the government can convince me that Alessandro is not a good person, but I know Alessandro, so I know that it must be because he's dissenting. That's the reason why. But in a society of strangers, it's more powerful to use a social score. And there are a bunch of other conclusions you can get out of that. Now, that's even if you don't unleash the citizen social graph. But of course,
can I stop you? Yes. Can I interrupt you? Not because you're calling on me. I'm happy to be an example, but I think as we're transitioning, there's a question in the Q&A, effectively asking you to relate these observations to the decaying general level of trust in society, kind of like the concerns that Robert Putnam worried about in Bowling Alone. So I guess as you're transitioning, this might be a good time to talk about trust.
Well, I mean, this is going beyond what I've done, to be honest. But it's true that when you have a society where people are enlarging their social circle, which is actually a good thing, because as Seabright was saying, it's actually when you live in your village, actually you are stuck with the relationship in your village. When you have access to more and more people, of course, you have more diversity, you have a better choice people you want to be with. And you have opportunities in big cities and the like. And of course, with globalization, you also have the ability to trade with more and more people, and with internet as well. So all of that is a good thing, but the cost of that is that we don't know each other as well. And you know, reputations are harder to enforce. So of course, platforms can do a good job with that. I mean, if you think about, you know, going back to China, how Alibaba created trust between buyer and seller on its platform is basically through ratings. I mean, through an escrow system, but also through a rating system. And that was very important, actually, to reestablish trust in trade. Now, in that case, it was in Alibaba's interest, actually, to reestablish a trade because it could make money out of it. So that also depends, and that also depends on who controls the information. So one conclusion I didn't discuss is actually that the government would actually like to control also the social score. So not let private social scores develop, because those private social scores actually might be built around data which are of more interest to people. They may not care about whether someone is a dissenter or not, or they may even approve if the person is a dissenter. So that may be expunged from the score by private parties. So the government wants to control social scores. Okay. Now, coming back to guild by association, that's something we, of course, is an old trick. If you think about Eastern Germany, of course, but in many countries, if you are associated with people who themselves are dissenters, then you are thought as being a dissenter yourself and treated as a dissenter. And the strategy behind that is pretty clear. It's to isolate even more the people who dissent, so that they lose, not only they lose much of what they have, but they also lose their friends and their families. And by the way, some religions have done exactly that as well. So they excommunicate people, but they also ask the remaining member not to basically socialize with these community people. And that's really an old trick. And of course, that makes it even more costly to dissent, because you lose one more thing, which is your family and your friends when you dissent, because the others are forced to ostracize you. Okay. And this is very costly socially for reasons you can understand, which is, of course, you destroy the community by doing that. But if you are sufficiently autocratic, you may end up doing that as well, and that has happened, of course. And you know, the Stasi has been very good at doing that. So that's really an issue. So the question you are going to ask me, and you know, again, we're just touching on the surface of what we should be doing in order to prevent this from happening. And all of us who are working on pricing, and actually Alessandro has done some important work on pricing, have to be thinking harder about what we can do. And today I don't have a huge amount of things to offer, but you know, the first protection you can have against this kind of thing is, of course, to have an independent Supreme Court. I emphasize independent Supreme Court, which, of course, can stop government from collecting those data and disseminating those data. But of course, the Supreme Court has to be strong enough. And you know, even in Europe now, but we saw that in the US, where the Supreme Court has done a pretty good job over the years. Now we see how fragile it has become, and we cannot take the Supreme Court trick as being for granted. Another thing we can do is to make sure that legacy data are destroyed over time, so that an autocratic government cannot exploit them when it comes to power. Of course, there are limits to that, which is, you know, for example, if there have been corrupt politicians, you like to keep the data about that, of course. you would like to. So exactly how you structure the memory of data is actually very important. But at least while you're still in democratic state, how do you manage to prevent an autocratic government when it comes to power to make use of those data? Third thing, and I'm really thinking aloud, to be honest. Could we draw international agreements? After all, for example, in armed conflicts, we have the Geneva Convention, which try to maintain a minimum of humanity. And as we know, and Timothy reminded us of, it's not that easy to do. But Geneva Convention is usually applied to wars between countries, but of course you can apply it to civil wars as well, for example, so within countries. And that gets closer to rules on prisons, for example, which is harm which can be inflicted by governments on their own citizens if the prisons are too awful. And as we know, all those things are hard to enforce, but we can try to. And after all, some of those things that are being done with data is a form of war, and a war against one's own citizens, and probably we should have an international agreement. So it may not be enforced, but it has some moral power still, and presumably it's still useful, even if it's not always enforced. Force protection is a protest movement. So of course, we have protest movements against autocrats, sometimes successful, sometimes they are less successful. But one question I want to ask is, can we have protest movements like Tiananmen Square, for example? Can we have them today? And that is not obvious, because now Tiananmen Square organizers will be, of course, listened to. Their conversation and emails and who they meet in the street will be recorded, of course, and that's really an issue. That's really an issue because it becomes harder and harder to mobilize people if they don't have access to encrypted private networks. Now, for other reasons, we don't necessarily like encrypted private networks, because they can be used by terrorists, they can be used by tax evaders, they can be used, etc. So, there is a whole set of things we need to think about in order to be able to keep the good stuff, the fact that the citizens can keep protesting, but at the same time, you don't want the bad side of those things as well, of too much bias in a sense. So we need to think more about that. And then, if none of that works, then we have to, as a last resort, of course, you have, revolt within the party, the dominant party, the ruling elite, or the military. But that's much harder for the citizens to control, of course. And, you have to do some wishful thinking. So, I'm putting that, as I said, nothing deep. I'm thinking aloud, but I really think that we need to spend more time on all those things. And I want to thank you a lot for your attention, and thanks so much for inviting me to give this seminar.
Thank you so much, John. I have just broadcast a message saying that if anybody from the audience wants to ask Jean a question, then we can use the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. You can ask it live. We have one question in the Q&A as it stands right now, and that relates to something that I wanted to ask you. So I'll give some more time and connect some more. The question in the Q&A is, I'm paraphrasing and summarizing, how does the autocrat's ability to develop and implement techniques to limit dissent depend on society's parameters? For example, on how individually or socially oriented the society is. And if I can use my privileges as chair here, we're also going to add to that, how do we view, for example, parameters such as those as being more or less conducive to changing equilibria, right? So there's surely a lot of inertia that's going to be built by autocratic measures like in these. I can think about the Chinese system, but also echo chambers on Facebook, and how do we think about moving forward, and which settings are more conducive to that?
Well, the first thing, of course, it's easier to prevent, in a sense, to try to prevent than to upset once it's in place. So, you know, if there is, I think that's very important, because we, at the start, it may look innocuous. You know, for example, the Chinese social credit system, I think it's pretty popular. You know, there is no, it's hard to know, but you know, it's not unpopular in China, because they have the experience, as I said, about, you know, Alibaba creating trust for some scoring and so on. So they realize that it can be useful, and you know, it may be one more instrument against those who behave very badly, without quite realizing that it can be used by the government for bad purposes. That means that we have to be very attentive to prevent, because again, it's easier to prevent that once it's in place. You have to organize, and that's a difficulty, because once you organize, you have to meet, you have to send email, you have to call people, you have to be on Zoom with people and so on. And that, given it's so easy to monitor nowadays, that it gets harder. So that will be the thing. Of course, society, well, that I don't know. I mean, you know, I would say, you know, a tight social fabric helps you resist better somehow, because we trust each other. But, you know, we saw how easily it was destroyed in Eastern Germany. You know, even families were destroyed. They didn't trust each other. So, you know, it's difficult. But, you know, I would say for more traditional societies, probably they are better able to resist, but it's just a very, very guess, I must say.
Could I ask a question, Jean, about the Chinese sort of social credit system? So this is a view that's not, I wish it was my original view, and I wanted your views as a theorist. So it's being, you know, a lot of us are being told about this social credit as something innovative or something that is semi-dystopian or transformative to society. And the view is, you know, if you put on your theorist hat and take sort of money as memory seriously, then we already have a social credit system here in the West. We call it our bank account. And sort of how you would think about this idea that we already, you know, that our bank balance already reflects the total amount of trust we're carrying around in society.
Well, that goes back to whether there is right policy in place. So I guess if I were an advocate of the social credit system, I would say, you know, there are things on which, I mean, that's another question of why we don't have the right policy. So, you know, Jean polluted with his car and blah, 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 and therefore it should be frowned upon, and he's getting bad credit. Now, if I were taxed properly with a Pigovian tax, then that will be your argument that money is memory somehow, and somehow that will show up in my bank account. And that's more generally the issue about the punishment, because in general, you can have a punishment which is monetary, that's a standard incentive system in economics, and you can have social punishment. You might think of the two as being substitutes to some extent. Also, I mean, you know, in the Chinese social credit system, they go together somehow. So they want, if you get a bad grade, you get also to pay more for certain things, but also at the same time, you also have social people frowning, frowning on your behavior. So basically, not liking you because you get a bad grade, and they ostracize you. So you get both aspects.
I guess this also, now that you started speaking, I remembered your paper with Roland on crowding out of how incentives or disincentives can crowd out social incentives and so on. So came back to me.
That's actually a good springboard for two related questions that the audience is asking about alternative rating systems, right? Jean, you mentioned how the suppression of private party, say, social scores or scores might be necessary to induce to have a successfully distorted score along some dimension. And both Santi and Andrea in the audience are asking about effectively, tech and big tech, and then the large amounts of data that they sit on. On the one hand, the question is, could they provide alternative products? On the other hand, what could be the social and the private value of that? And so while we're here, we can ask for your take on, what would be the outcome of competition in ratings in that sense.
Well, in a sense, it's a good question. There are already alternative products, because we get rated by credit bureaus, we are rated by Uber, rated by eBay, and so on. So and hopefully that doesn't reflect our sexuality or our political opinion or our views on Ukraine versus Russia. But so there is that. Also an interesting fact, and I don't know why. Actually, maybe someone in the audience knows, but Alibaba and Tencent have licenses for producing those ratings, but they haven't been quite renewed. At least last time I looked, they were not quite renewed. So I don't know if the government really want to have a monopoly on the ratings or something. I don't know. Something we have to realize, and that's really the digression, is that tech actually can do pretty much the same thing with the same reasoning. And I'm not saying they're doing that, but they can rate politicians in some way pretty easily. So the rating in that case is not a 531. It's basically a coverage of something that is not glamorous or a bad picture of the person, or there are many ways, and might actually use that as a pressure because of course politicians have image concerns just like you and me, and perhaps even stronger image concern than we do have, because they're public people. And then they could basically threaten politicians to give them a bad rating, so basically have a bad representation of their activities if, for example, they call for more regulation of tech, something like that. That would be the equivalent of dissent. Someone who say, I want to regulate tech, and then all and below you end up with with a bad coverage by Google News or whatever. I'm not saying that has happened. It's just the possibilities. I don't want to give them ideas to do it either.
Colin, go ahead.
Sorry, Jean. So you had a line in one of your slides in which you said that you get a particular result if and only if the government is sufficiently autocratic. So that suggests to me there must be a theorem here. Do you have a theorem, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, as usual, it's pretty abstract, but basically it's basically, as I said, the object function of the government goes all the way from welfare maximization, so you care for the citizens, to minimizing dissent, and you don't care about the citizens, and everything in between. And how much weight you put on those two criteria basically determines how autocratic you are. So and it's very simple-minded, but basically, if you emphasize dissent suppression much more, then that means you are autocratic. If you care about your citizens, you're never going to do that kind of stuff. That's in the AER last year. If you are a welfare maximizer, you don't do that kind of stuff. At least the social score you may have, but then you have only stuff which have to do with consensual issues, things people agree on.
Thank you.
While we're transitioning towards theory, there is a question about positive selection in the chat, asking you whether the positive selection you, Jean, studied before plays a role in the process of privacy erosion. As it gets harder and harder to be a dissident if the autocrat is able to consistently retain a core of persons that are not dissidents, even as the autocrat tightens over time. So there is this question, and then another one that's relating to private and social networks. So many of us theorists here in the audience are, I'm sure, thinking about dynamics in some of these models, and so I think both of these questions are getting at this.
Those are very, very good questions, and I hope you are going to work on that. It's true. I mean, over time, when people give up on their freedom somehow, then you have positive selection in the sense the people who stay are the people who are the most motivated. And then the question is, how does it work? The paper on positive selection was about whether you want to exploit those or you want to keep them as a tax base somehow. I mean, in both cases, you exploit them, but now this is not, I didn't apply that to actually the kind of situations you have in mind. And that would be very interesting to do. Honestly, I don't have the answer. I have this paper last year with Mohamed Saleh on Egypt in the 7th century, 7th to 10th century, on basically how the Muslim power dealt with Copts and other minorities, religious majorities, which used to be majorities, but of course turned into minorities, and whether they actually, whether they wanted actually to eliminate those minorities, or whether they wanted to basically profit from those minorities, because those minorities were willing, in order to keep their religion, were willing to actually pay a fair amount of money, and how it influenced the tax system in those 3 centuries. So what this shows is that you can do work on this with the dynamics in areas which are quite different from the ones we usually work on in economics. But and please, if you want to pursue this, I would love to see that.
So there's a question here that's asking about the plausibility of like reverse causation, that essentially you start from echo chambers in a closed society, and these grow to the point where they become bases for autocratic. I guess it's somewhat related to the dynamics again, but have you thought at all about that, or do you have thoughts on this, on these kinds of? I mean, here you're positing privacy as a good, but it's almost the opposite. Public, the ability to form these, clusters of conspiracy theories, for instance, might be a public bad.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was mentioning earlier, which is that, being in a safe space actually protects you, and that part is good. It protects you from the other side. But then things happen in those safe spaces which are not that nice, especially if there's a lot of social pressure. So, you are on a Facebook group with conspiracy theory and whatnot, and then you become part of the game. So you have to basically, oh yeah, this narrative is wonderful, even so it's bullshit. And that's one thing. So the narrative circulate, but then you have all those things that happen in those closed groups. So the typical thing is they go and are violent against the out group, and everything which has to do with group behavior, it can go from something which is very good, which is some cohesion and protection, and that can go all the way to being an oppressor. And it's I haven't gone further in my own research, but it's actually and the reverse causation and the relationship between this and the political power is also very, very interesting. By the way, an interesting thing is that our privacy is disappearing because of those technologies, but those technologies partly allow us to keep some privacy. The Facebook group where you find the people who think exactly like you is a new thing. And of course, there were other ways of doing it before, but those were more difficult and time consuming. Now, Facebook, even until recently, recommended to you people who thought exactly like you.
I guess this last question is bringing back the question of how do we introduce change in this in a world like this, right? Because what Saqib in the question was asking is really, does then the presence of echo chambers and multiple but related Facebook groups where everybody thinks alike then constitute the basis of support for a, let's call them autocratic or more extremist politician who then has sufficient support. And so I think there's an important sense in which the status quo matters now for any type of.
It's very interesting actually, because then the circulation of diffusion of information doesn't exist because you have different groups in society, and a group saying no, those are fake news and the like, it doesn't have any access. They're just different people, or the group doesn't want to listen to them, and so on. So that's a difficult thing. I mean, all those things are fascinating things, and we need to put more work. And all of you who are attending this, and if you can do more work on this, that would be a public service. And of course, people from the Kyiv School of Economics and Timothy, I hope soon you'll be able to go back to research, and I can see you again in conferences and the like, and read your papers, which I've always enjoyed in the past. And that is something that will be extremely useful to do. I mean, as a learner of research, because we are way behind. It's happening right now, with the technology coming and all those. We thought democracy had won, right? And we just realized it hasn't won. And how do we deal with that?
I think this is a very constructive and then hopeful point where to take stock of our conversation. Both because you've given us a bunch of future research agendas, and because we're all looking forward to hearing Tima present live and your colleagues as soon as possible. So why don't I propose that we thank Jean once more, pause or stop the recording, and part of the plan was that anybody who wants to hang around and talk more informally, we can